Welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every case challenges your intellect, every clue sharpens your instincts, and every mystery pulls you deeper into the unknown. Grab a seat, stay sharp, and let's unravel the truth together. Chapter 1. The Deadly Wager. The chandeliers of Ashford Manor glittered like 1,000 tiny stars, their golden glow casting elegant shadows on the polished floors. The dining hall, with its high ceilings and intricate wood panelling, was filled with the murmurs of polite conversation, the clinking of fine crystal, and the soft strains of a violin quartet playing in the corner. Lord Reginald Ashford, a man of aristocratic bearing and impeccable manners, presided over the evening's affairs with effortless grace. Seated at the grand table were London's elite and infamous alike, each guest handpicked for their notoriety or influence. This was no ordinary gathering. Ashford's dinners were legendary, known for their extravagant feasts and, more notably, the games of chance that inevitably followed. Here, fortunes had been won, reputations shattered, and secrets exchanged under the guise of innocent wagers. And tonight would be no different. At the far end of the table sat Charles Whitmore, a man whose name was synonymous with both fortune and folly. A gambler of considerable skill and even greater arrogance, Whitmore relished the thrill of a wager, believing himself invincible at the art of risk. Beside him, Eleanor Hartley, his devoted fiancée, smiled demurely, though her eyes betrayed a quiet unease. To their left, Henry Stokes, a sharp-eyed businessman with a perpetual scowl, sipped his wine in brooding silence. And across from him, the enigmatic Madame Renée Laurent, draped in dark silks and pearls, observed the room with a knowing gaze, her lips curved in a secretive smile. The evening was pleasant, the conversation engaging, but beneath the civility there was an undercurrent, a tension unspoken, a game already set in motion. As the servants cleared away the final course, Lord Ashford leaned back in his chair, swirling the deep red liquid in his glass. His gaze drifted across his guests, eyes sharp with amusement. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said smoothly, "tonight we find ourselves in the presence of some of London's finest minds and sharpest instincts, and yet among us sits one man who believes himself superior to chance itself." All eyes turned to Charles Whitmore, who smirked and raised his glass in a mock toast. "I merely state facts, Lord Ashford," Whitmore replied, his voice dripping with self-assurance. "A bet is not a matter of chance, but of calculation. The fool relies on luck. The skilled man ensures he never loses." Across the table, Henry Stokes scoffed, setting his glass down with a little too much force. "Strange, then, that you've left a trail of ruined men in your wake, Whitmore. Or do they simply lack your skill?" Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly around her napkin, but she said nothing. Madame Laurent gave a soft laugh. "You play with fire, monsieur. Even the cleverest gambler meets his match eventually." Whitmore's grin widened. "Madame, I would stake my very life on a wager if I knew the odds favoured me." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Lord Ashford's lips curved into a slow smile. "Would you indeed, Whitmore? Well then, perhaps tonight we shall test that claim." The warmth of the room seemed to dim as the conversation turned toward fate and the consequences of a wager. "Luck is merely an illusion," Whitmore declared, leaning forward, his eyes glinting with reckless certainty. "Those who speak of it do so only to justify their failures." "And yet," Poirot's voice, soft but firm, cut through the air like a blade, "the greatest gamblers in history have fallen, mon ami. Do you suggest they were all simply incompetent?" Whitmore laughed, dismissing the thought with a wave of his hand. "They lacked nerve. A true player knows when to hold his ground and when to raise the stakes." Henry Stokes exhaled sharply. "Easy words for a man who never pays the price himself." Eleanor turned to Whitmore, her voice softer, almost pleading. "But Charles, surely even you must acknowledge, there are some wagers not worth making." Whitmore turned to her, his gaze unreadable. "Every wager is worth making if the prize is high enough." The words sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. Across the table, Madame Laurent swirled the wine in her glass thoughtfully. "And what, monsieur, is the highest stake one can offer?" Whitmore held her gaze, a slow, taunting smile playing at his lips. "Why, one's own life, of course." A hush fell over the table. Lord Ashford studied Whitmore carefully before leaning forward with measured ease. "Intriguing," he mused. "Perhaps, then, you'd care to place such a bet?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Whitmore met his gaze without hesitation. "Name the terms." And just like that, the game began. The air inside Ashford Manor had thickened, though not from the warmth of the fire or the weight of fine dining. No, it was something far less tangible, an unspoken challenge, a game yet to be played. Lord Reginald Ashford, ever the charming host, leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping idly against the rim of his glass. His gaze settled upon Charles Whitmore, whose earlier boast, his willingness to wager even his life, still lingered in the charged silence of the room. "A man of conviction," Ashford mused, his voice laced with amusement. "But words, dear boy, are cheap." Whitmore's smirk did not falter. "Then let us make them expensive." The conversation hushed. Even Madame Laurent, ever unreadable, tilted her head in quiet curiosity. "And what, precisely, shall we stake?" Ashford continued, swirling the deep red liquid in his glass. Whitmore's gaze did not waver. "Name your terms." Ashford chuckled. "Ah, but that would be telling." "No, my dear Whitmore, a wager is only truly worthy if the terms remain a mystery, until the moment of reckoning." A flicker of something, doubt perhaps, crossed Eleanor Hartley's face. "Charles, this is absurd." Whitmore lifted her hand to his lips in a mocking kiss. "Fear not, my dear. I have never lost." Ashford's smile deepened. "Then I shall expect you in my study before the night is through." No more was said, but the game had begun. The players would soon discover that some wagers demand more than gold, that fate, once tempted, is rarely kind. The morning arrived with an eerie stillness. The grand halls of Ashford Manor, which had been so alive with laughter and whispered wagers the night before, now stood in unnerving silence. The servants moved with hushed urgency, their gazes darting toward the heavy oak doors of the study, locked from within. Lord Ashford stood at the threshold, face pale, fist clenched. "He has not emerged," he muttered. A decisive rap at the door. No answer. Another, firmer this time. Still silence. Then came the forceful push. The door gave way, and there, slumped over his desk, was Charles Whitmore. The remains of a half-drained glass lay near his outstretched hand. A deck of cards lay scattered before him, some resting on the floor, others clinging precariously to the edge of the desk. A faint scent, bitter, unmistakable, lingered in the air. Poirot was first to step forward, his expression unreadable. He observed the unnatural stillness of the body, the peculiar way the glass sat just beyond Whitmore's fingertips. He exhaled softly. "Murder," he murmured. The guests gathered in shocked whispers, but Poirot's focus did not waver. His sharp gaze fell upon a sealed envelope, placed deliberately before the body. 3 words were scrawled across its surface in ink that had not yet fully dried. "The debt is paid." Poirot moved with deliberate precision, his little grey cells already stirring. The glass, a faint trace of cyanide lingering within its depths. Not a careless act, but a calculated one. The scattered cards, not merely disordered, but incomplete. One was missing, a card removed, but for what purpose? And then the sealed envelope, the ink still fresh. Poirot's fingers traced the edge of the envelope as he glanced at Lord Ashford. "Monsieur, this bet of yours, what were its terms?" Ashford's jaw tightened. "It was not about money." Poirot nodded, as if he had already known. His eyes flickered toward the missing card, the cyanide, the message left behind. The game had been played, but the rules had not yet been revealed. Something was amiss. Poirot exhaled, glancing toward the pale morning light seeping through the windows. This was no ordinary wager, he murmured. This was a challenge to death. The murmurs in the study swelled like a rising tide. Charles Whitmore had been found slumped over his desk, a half-drained glass at his side, the bitter scent of cyanide lingering in the air. To the untrained eye, the conclusion seemed inevitable. Suicide. His gambling debts must have caught up with him, muttered Henry Stokes, shaking his head. He always thought himself invincible. Eleanor Hartley let out a strangled sob. No, Charles would never… Poirot raised a hand, silencing the speculation. His sharp gaze swept the room. Mes amis, he said, it is dangerous to see only what is placed before us. Suicide? Number. This is something much more deliberate. The room stilled. Poirot bent closer to the desk, his moustache twitching. The objects before him did not speak of a man's despair, but of careful staging. This was not the end of a reckless gambler's luck. This was murder. Poirot moved with quiet deliberation, his eyes taking in the precise details others overlooked. The glass, placed just out of Whitmore's reach, as though set there after his hand had fallen still. The playing cards, scattered, but not randomly so. A pattern had been disturbed, but one card was missing. The body itself, slumped unnaturally, rigid in a way that suggested he had not collapsed mid-drink, but rather had been positioned afterward. Poirot straightened. Non, mon ami, he murmured, addressing the lifeless figure of Whitmore. You did not choose to die tonight, did you? A flicker of understanding passed through his mind. The murder had been designed, carefully, to mimic suicide. But why? And more importantly, by whom? His eyes narrowed. There was one thing left to examine, the sealed envelope, deliberately placed before the body. Poirot's fingers hovered over the envelope, its message scrawled in stark ink. The debt is paid. Carefully, he lifted the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The room held its breath as he scanned the page. Then, his expression darkened. Well? Lord Ashford prompted, his voice taut. Poirot remained silent a moment longer, his mind absorbing each word. Finally, he exhaled. This is no ordinary wager, mes amis. This was a game played in shadows, one where the loser would pay not in money, but in life. Madame Laurent, ever composed, tilted her head. A confession, perhaps? No, Poirot said, shaking his head. A final move in a game far older than last night's bet. Whitmore knew something that made him a target, and his killer ensured that knowledge died with him. His fingers traced the words once more. The debt is paid. But paid to whom? And for what? One thing was certain. This murder had been long in the making. Poirot set the letter down, his mind assembling the puzzle before him. The cyanide, the scattered cards, the missing piece, the message left behind. Then he looked up, his gaze sharp as a blade. Mes amis, he said, his voice solemn. This was no mere wager. The guests remained frozen, caught between shock and anticipation. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, to settle in their bones. Then, with quiet finality, he spoke the words none of them wished to hear. This was a challenge. To death. A challenge that had now been answered. The true game had only just begun. Chapter 2. The Suspects and Their Secrets. The grand hall of Ashford Manor had lost its warmth. What had been a place of indulgence the night before now felt like a courtroom, with Hercule Poirot as its judge. The guests, once draped in merriment, now sat rigidly in their chairs, their gazes shifting uneasily. The murder of Charles Whitmore had cast a long shadow, and Poirot, ever methodical, wasted no time in piercing through the veil of pretense. I ask only for the truth, Poirot began, his voice crisp yet measured. The events of last night, every moment, every glance, every word exchanged, they matter. Lord Reginald Ashford remained by the fireplace, arms crossed. Henry Stokes scowled, his fingers tapping against his knee. Madame René Laurent observed Poirot coolly, while Eleanor Hartley dabbed at her reddened eyes with a lace handkerchief. Poirot folded his hands. "We shall begin with Mademoiselle Hartley." His gaze softened ever so slightly. "Tell me, if you please, the nature of your relationship with Monsieur Whitmore." Eleanor swallowed hard. "He was my fiancé." Poirot nodded. "And yet, mademoiselle, I sense there is more to be said." Eleanor hesitated. Secrets were a currency in Ashford Manor, and now they would be spent. Eleanor's grip on her handkerchief tightened. He was going to end it," she whispered. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Henry Stokes raised an eyebrow. Madame Laurent merely smiled. Poirot leaned forward. "When did you learn of this?" "Last night," Eleanor admitted. "He told me after dinner. He said he had obligations." Her voice trembled. "That he could not be tied down." Poirot studied her carefully. "You were distressed, naturally." Eleanor let out a bitter laugh. "Distressed? I was humiliated. I have stood by Charles through every scandal, every reckless bet, every—" Her breath hitched, and just like that, he was done with me. Poirot's voice remained gentle, but firm. "Did you argue?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes, but I left before it escalated. She hesitated, glancing at the others. "I wanted to be alone." "Yet you did not return to your chambers," Poirot observed. "A maid reported seeing you in the east corridor well after midnight." Eleanor's lips parted, but she said nothing. "Tell me, mademoiselle," Poirot continued, his voice impossibly soft. "Were you alone?" Eleanor's silence was answer enough. Henry Stokes exhaled sharply. "What exactly are you implying, Poirot?" "Nothing yet," Poirot answered lightly. "Only that you and Monsieur Whitmore had a complicated financial history, no?" Stokes scowled. "I lost a considerable sum to Whitmore, yes, but I am hardly the first to suffer under his greed." "Lost?" Poirot tilted his head. "Or was it taken?" The businessman's nostrils flared. "He cheated me." A murmur swept through the room. Even Lord Ashford turned his head slightly. Stokes clenched his fists. "A week ago, he wagered my company's shares on a friendly bet. He swore it was fair play. But then I found out he had stacked the odds." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And yet you did not confront him?" "Oh, I did," Stokes spat. "Last night, in fact. I told him he was a fraud, that I would see to it that he paid back every penny. He laughed in my face. His lips curled. Said I should consider it a lesson in humility." Poirot tapped his chin. "A man such as yourself, proud, wealthy, does not take well to being humiliated." Stokes narrowed his eyes. "I don't like what you're suggesting." Poirot only smiled. "Ah, but I have suggested nothing, monsieur." But the seed of doubt had been planted. All eyes turned to Madame René Laurent, who, unlike the others, seemed entirely unperturbed by the proceedings. Poirot folded his hands. "Madame, you spoke little last night, but I believe you observe much." A slow smile spread across her lips. "Indeed, Monsieur Poirot, but observation is not always meant to be shared." Poirot nodded. "And yet, you alluded to a debt Monsieur Whitmore owed you." Laurent tilted her head. "Did I?" "You did," Poirot confirmed. "And now I ask plainly, what was he to you?" A pause. Then, "A thief," she said simply. A hush fell over the room. Even Stokes looked startled. "Charles Whitmore stole from you," Poirot pressed. Laurent sighed, examining her nails. "Years ago, he borrowed a rather valuable painting from my personal collection, promised to return it, promised to win it back for me. And yet, despite his many wins, the painting was never returned." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And so, You sought repayment? She smiled. Of course. Did he pay? Madame Laurent took a slow sip of her wine. Not yet. Poirot studied her, noting the deliberate choice of words. Not he did not pay, but not yet. Do you grieve for Monsieur Whitmore? Poirot asked suddenly. Laurent's lips curled. Grief is for those who lose something they love, Monsieur Poirot. I lost nothing. A chill settled in the air. Poirot's little grey cells were stirring. Secrets lay thick in Ashford Manor, and the truth was only beginning to take shape. Lord Reginald Ashford stood by the mantelpiece, his fingers trailing absently along the intricate carvings of the wood. His expression was unreadable, detached, as though the tragedy that had befallen his household was nothing more than a regrettable inconvenience. Poirot, ever the keen observer, studied the man for a moment before speaking. Monsieur, you were the one who proposed the wager to Whitmore, were you not? Ashford gave a slow nod. I did. And yet, you offer little insight into its nature. Ashford sighed, swirling the brandy in his glass. What does it matter now, Poirot? The wager is void. Charles is dead. Poirot's eyes gleamed. But that, Lord Ashford, is precisely why it matters. A flicker of irritation crossed Ashford's face. It was a test of nerve, nothing more. Charles was insufferably confident in his own luck. I wished to see if his resolve would hold when faced with real risk. And what was this risk? Ashford hesitated. It was private. Poirot tilted his head. A wager of this nature. It was not about money, was it? Ashford's grip on his glass tightened. No. A pause. Poirot leaned in slightly. It was about something far more valuable. Ashford met his gaze. Yes. Poirot did not press further. Not yet. But secrets lay heavy in Lord Ashford's silence. Poirot's sharp gaze swept the study, landing on the fireplace. The embers had long since cooled, but among the blackened remains, something caught his attention. A fragment of parchment, charred at the edges. With careful precision, he retrieved it, smoothing it against the desk. Faint ink marks remained, the words broken, yet not beyond reconstruction. Will ruin us both if he tells them. Poirot's fingers tapped against his chin. Tells them what? Madame Laurent, watching from her chair, arched an eyebrow. Fascinating, is it not, Monsieur Poirot? How truth and fire are such natural enemies. Poirot did not respond. His mind was racing. Someone had tried to destroy this letter, but not entirely. Had they been interrupted? Or had they left just enough for him to find? One thing was certain. Whitmore had known something. Something worth killing for. Poirot turned his attention to the desk, his fingers tracing the polished surface. Then he stopped. Etched into the wood, subtle but deliberate, was a strange symbol. A circle bisected by a sharp vertical line. Poirot's moustache twitched. He had seen such symbols before. A mark of secrecy, of debts yet to be settled. He made a note of it before shifting his attention to the personal effects on the desk. Whitmore had always carried a gold money clip, a symbol of his wealth and status. It should have been here, among his belongings, but it was not. Murder, Poirot murmured, is rarely without motive, but it is also rarely without theft. The missing clip, was it a clue, a trophy, or had it been taken to mislead? One mystery fed another. Poirot turned back to Eleanor. Mademoiselle, I have heard your account, but I wonder, is there something more? She stiffened. I have told you everything. Ah, Poirot sighed, but in telling everything, one often leaves out the most important. Eleanor hesitated. Poirot let her silence speak before shifting to Henry Stokes. And you, monsieur, your alibi? I was in my room. Poirot's eyebrows lifted. Alone. Stokes frowned. Yes. Poirot's eyes twinkled. Then it is not an alibi, is it? Stokes scowled but said nothing. Two individuals, each with something to hide. But what? The pieces were shifting, but the puzzle was far from complete. The night was cold, the air dense with mist. Poirot stood by the window, deep in thought. The wager, the burnt letter, the missing money clip, the symbol, nothing fit together, not yet. And then, movement, a figure, barely visible through the fog, watching. Poirot's pulse quickened. The guilty always returned to the scene of the crime. His eyes narrowed. It seems, mes amis, that we are not alone in our search for the truth. The game was far from over. Chapter 3. The Ghost of Past. Bets. Hercule Poirot sat at Lord Ashford's vast mahogany desk, a pile of tattered ledgers and yellowed letters before him. The more he examined, the clearer the picture became. Charles Whitmore had lived by the gamble, and others had paid the price. For years he had orchestrated wagers not of fortune alone, but of lives ruined, reputations destroyed, businesses lost. His bets had been more than reckless. They had been cruel. Poirot's finger traced a name repeated across several documents. Victor Langley. He turned to Hastings, who stood watching. Mon cher, observe. Whitmore's past is not merely one of financial ruin. It is one of destruction. Look here. Victor Langley, a man ruined 5 years ago by a wager he could never win. Lord Ashford, standing nearby, exhaled slowly. Langley. Yes, I recall. He was once a man of means, until Whitmore led him to the slaughter. Poirot's brows lifted. Ah, and what, precisely, was the bet that cost him everything? Ashford's gaze darkened. His name, his reputation, his very existence. A silence settled. Whitmore had left devastation in his wake, and now it seemed that devastation had come back to claim him. Poirot leaned back, his fingers steepled. Tell me of Langley. Lord Ashford sighed. 5 years ago, Victor Langley was a respected investor. He dabbled in speculation, but always carefully. Then Whitmore came along. He paused. Whitmore offered him a bet, a business venture, a private investment that could turn Langley into a titan of industry. Hastings frowned. And he fell for it? Ashford nodded grimly. The bet was rigged from the start. Langley placed everything, his estate, his fortune, into Whitmore's so-called sure thing. Within weeks, it was all gone. Whitmore had played both sides, ensuring Langley lost. Poirot's moustache twitched. And what became of Monsieur Langley? A long silence. Then, he drowned, Ashford said quietly. A month after losing everything, they found him in the Thames. Poirot murmured, almost to himself, a wager of death. The room seemed colder. Whitmore had gambled with another man's life, and now it seemed fate had gambled with his. Victor Langley may have died, Poirot said, but I suspect his story did not end there. He tapped a finger on the ledger, flipping to a column of debts never settled. His wife, Margaret Langley. What became of her? Ashford hesitated. She vanished. Poirot's eyebrows lifted. Vanished? Ashford nodded. After Langley's death, she was ruined. The estate was taken. The creditors circled. One day she simply disappeared. Some say she fled to the continent. Others, he hesitated. Others say she stayed in England, waiting. Poirot's fingers drummed against the desk. Waiting. For what, Lord Ashford? Ashford exhaled. For revenge. The words sat heavy in the room. Hastings cleared his throat. Poirot, do you think... Poirot nodded. I think, my friend, that a woman wronged is a force to be reckoned with. He turned the ledger once more. Margaret Langley had sworn vengeance, and now Charles Whitmore lay dead. Had the widow finally played her hand? Poirot rose, moving to Whitmore's study. His sharp eyes swept the desk once more. Then, a glint of silver, a locket. It lay tucked behind a stack of letters, almost as if placed there deliberately, waiting to be found. Poirot picked it up, examining the intricate floral engravings on the front. He opened it. Inside, a photograph. A woman, young, beautiful, her eyes heavy with sorrow. "Margaret Langley," Poirot murmured. Hastings stepped closer. Good Lord, why would Whitmore have this? Poirot's gaze sharpened. Indeed, Hastings, why? Had Whitmore kept it as a token of remorse? Or had someone left it as a warning? One thing was certain. The past was not done with Charles Whitmore, and neither was Margaret Langley. Poirot stood over the open ledger, his fingers trailing along the last recorded transactions of Charles Whitmore. The figures at first glance appeared routine: wagers placed, losses accounted for, and debts marked as paid. But then, something caught his eye. "A withdrawal," he murmured. "A substantial one." Lord Ashford peered over his shoulder. £20,000, that is no small sum. Poirot nodded. And yet, there is no record of where it went. Hastings frowned. Perhaps he was settling a debt. Or paying someone off, Poirot corrected. His fingers tapped the inked figures. Whitmore was a man who wielded money like a weapon. If he was withdrawing such a sum on the very day of his death, one must ask, was he the one making a final move, or was he being made to comply? Madame Laurent observed coolly from her chair. Men like Whitmore do not pay debts, they demand them. Poirot's moustache twitched. Indeed, madame, but if that is true, then why? He tapped the page. Did he withdraw his own fortune, only to die hours later? A man does not pay his killer before he is killed, unless, of course, it was not meant to be murder. Poirot turned another page of the ledger, and then a single line, scrawled hastily at the bottom. One last gamble. His fingers traced the words. The ink was darker than the rest, written recently. Not an ordinary entry. A message. Hastings leaned in. Good Lord, Poirot, do you think he knew? Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. Perhaps, mon ami, or perhaps he was issuing a challenge. Lord Ashford crossed his arms. Charles never could resist a bet. He saw everything as a game, even when the stakes were too high. Poirot exhaled slowly. But what, I wonder, was the nature of this wager? He glanced back at the withdrawal entry. Did Whitmore gamble his fortune one last time? His gaze darkened. Or did he gamble his life? For the first time, Poirot felt an unease creeping into his mind. If Whitmore had known he was playing a dangerous game, then his death was not merely an act of vengeance, it was an execution. And the question remained. Who was sitting across the table? Margaret Langley, the woman who had every reason to want Charles Whitmore dead, the woman who had vanished after her husband's ruin, only to resurface in the shadows of this crime. Hastings cleared his throat. It's obvious, isn't it? She's returned. Revenge, plain and simple. Poirot remained silent, considering. And yet, Hastings, is it not a little too obvious? He paced. A locket, left where it could be found. A name that whispers through every clue. A woman who has disappeared for years, only to suddenly resurface? He shook his head. No, mon ami. This is the work of someone very clever. Framing her? Hastings asked. Poirot's moustache twitched. Or ensuring she becomes the only suspect. If Margaret Langley was truly back, she had hidden herself well, and if she was not, then the real killer had played their hand to perfection. Poirot's sharp eyes turned to Henry Stokes. You claimed you were in your room, monsieur. Stokes folded his arms. And I was. Poirot smiled. Ah, but you forget, my friend, that silence is its own confession. A single sheet of paper was set before him, a servant's report, confirming that Stokes had left his chambers after midnight. Stokes paled. Hastings exhaled. So, Stokes, where were you? A long pause. Then, I was with Charles. The admission rang through the room like a pistol shot. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, now we begin to see. The manor had fallen silent. Poirot stood near the window, the weight of the case pressing upon him. The puzzle pieces were aligning, but something was missing. Then, a sudden crash. A shout from the corridor. Hastings was the first to move, but Poirot already knew. The murderer was not yet finished. A second attempt had been made, and now the game had turned deadly. Chapter 4. The Gambler's Last Trick. The guests of Ashford Manor were uneasy. The weight of Whitmore's murder loomed over them, a spectre that refused to be exorcised. They had answered Poirot's questions, offered alibis, and yet the truth remained elusive. It was time to force the killer's hand. Standing in the grand hall, Poirot clasped his hands together and announced, "Mes amis, we shall play a game." Lord Ashford frowned. "A game?" Poirot nodded. "A wager, if you will. One that will reveal the murderer." Henry Stokes scoffed. "And how, exactly, do you propose to do that?" Poirot's moustache twitched. "We shall recreate the night's events. A second wager shall be placed. This time, I expect our murderer will have much to lose." A silence followed, thick with apprehension. Madame Laurent's lips curled into an amused smile, but her eyes held suspicion. Eleanor Hartley shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the arms of her chair. Poirot continued, his voice smooth yet firm. "At midnight, we shall all gather in Whitmore's study. There the final bet shall be made." A challenge. A risk. A gamble where only one outcome remained. The truth. The killer had played their hand once before. Now, it was Poirot's turn. The heavy grandfather clock in Whitmore's study struck midnight. One by one, the guests arrived, their faces pale under the dim candlelight. Lord Ashford stood stiffly by the fireplace, his expression unreadable. Henry Stokes hovered near the drinks cabinet, fingers twitching at his cuffs. Eleanor Hartley remained close to Poirot, eyes darting toward the empty desk where Whitmore had once sat. Madame Laurent, however, was perfectly composed. "Monsieur Poirot, you do enjoy theatrics," she murmured. Poirot merely smiled. "A touch of drama, madame, often loosens the tongue." He gestured toward the desk. At its centre, a single deck of cards lay waiting. "The game is simple," Poirot said. "One final hand, the same as the night before." The silence was deafening. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Then Lord Ashford spoke, his voice low. "And what precisely is the stake?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Why, the same as before, mon ami. A man's life." A sharp inhale from Eleanor, a flicker of something, anger, fear, in Stokes's gaze. The trap was set, and the killer, whoever they were, was already caught within it. Poirot's fingers traced the edges of the playing cards. "Curious, is it not," he mused, "that Whitmore's deck was incomplete?" Henry Stokes frowned. "What of it?" Poirot lifted a card from the pile. "A deck with a missing card suggests foul play. But I wondered, what if the missing card was not removed, but replaced?" From his pocket, he produced another deck. Identical. A duplicate. A murmur swept through the room. Lord Ashford's expression darkened. "Where did you find that?" Poirot's gaze never wavered. "In your study, Lord Ashford." A hush. The accusation hung in the air. Eleanor gasped. "You think, mademoiselle?" Poirot interrupted. "Number, I do not think. I know." He laid the two decks side by side. "A second deck means only one thing. The game was rigged. Whitmore never had a chance." Lord Ashford's fists clenched. "This is absurd." Poirot only smiled. "Is it, mon ami? Then why, I wonder, did Whitmore's final bet lead only to his death? A game of chance? Number this had been murder, carefully planned, executed with precision. And now the pieces were finally falling into place. From the moment Whitmore's gold money clip was discovered missing, Poirot had known it would return. And now, there it was, resting neatly on the mantelpiece, polished, untouched. A gasp from Eleanor. "That wasn't there before." Poirot nodded. "Non, mademoiselle, it was not." His fingers brushed over the initials engraved on the metal. CWA possession so dear to Whitmore, yet it had been missing from his body. Why? Lord Ashford's voice was tight. Someone placed it there. Indeed. Poirot turned the clip over, his thumb pressing against the small hinge at its base. With a soft click, the panel slid open, revealing a slip of folded parchment. Madame Laurent's smile faltered. "What is that?" Poirot unfolded the note, his lips curled. "A name, madame, the name of his killer." The room fell into stunned silence. Poirot exhaled. Ah, so now, at last the game is over. The final wager had been made, and the price, a man's life. The room had grown colder. The weight of Poirot's revelations pressed upon the guests like an unseen hand. Then, a single revelation shifted the tide, a note found among Whitmore's belongings, bearing Eleanor Hartley's name. Henry Stokes scoffed. "It is obvious, isn't it? She had every reason to want him dead. He humiliated her, discarded her like a used card." Lord Ashford nodded slowly. "And if I recall, Eleanor was unaccounted for during the time of the murder." Eleanor's breath hitched. "No, I swear to you I had nothing to do with Charles's death." Poirot raised a hand, silencing the accusations. "Mes amis, let us not be too hasty. Mademoiselle Hartley was indeed betrayed by Monsieur Whitmore, but tell me, does that make her a murderer?" Madame Laurent's lips curled. "It makes her capable." Poirot studied Eleanor. "Non, I do not believe it." His gaze flickered toward the desk, where the damning note rested. "This, I think, was left for us to find. But by whom? The real murderer had been clever. But perhaps, just perhaps, they had been too clever." As accusations swirled around Eleanor, Poirot's gaze drifted toward Lord Ashford. The man stood rigid, but his hands betrayed him. Fingers clenched, then unclenched. A slow tremor ran through them, so slight it would have gone unnoticed, except by Poirot. "Lord Ashford," he said lightly, "one might think you are nervous." Ashford exhaled sharply. "Nonsense." Poirot tilted his head. "Is it? I wonder, do your hands shake because of the cold?" He stepped closer. "Or because they once held a glass, a poisoned glass?" A hush fell over the room. Ashford's face darkened. "Poirot, you insult me." Poirot merely smiled. "Ah, but I do not deal in insults, mon ami. I deal in truth." The trembling hands, the unspoken fear behind Ashford's eyes. Guilt was a heavy thing to carry, and it was crushing him. Poirot's voice remained calm. "Tell me, Lord Ashford, have you had your coat cleaned recently?" Ashford stiffened. "What?" Poirot gestured toward his sleeve. "There, just at the cuff. A stain." Ashford glanced down instinctively, and in that moment, Poirot saw it, the slightest twitch of panic. Poirot reached forward, his fingers grazing the fabric. The stain was faint, but unmistakable, a trace of dried blood. Henry Stokes's eyes widened. "Good God!" Madame Laurent exhaled softly. "So the game is up." Ashford swallowed hard. "This means nothing." But Poirot shook his head. "No, Lord Ashford, it means everything." The trembling hands, the misplaced deck, the note planted to frame Eleanor, and now this. The pieces had finally aligned, and the game was over. Poirot turned to face the assembled guests. "Mes amis," he said, voice steady, "the game is over." The tension in the room was thick, all eyes locked on him. Poirot exhaled softly. "I have seen every move, every deception, and now at last, I know who made the final bet." A single moment of silence. Then Poirot turned to Lord Ashford. "You, mon ami." His voice was almost gentle. "You orchestrated it all." Ashford's breath caught. The room held its collective breath. Poirot's gaze did not waver. "Shall we lay our cards on the table?" Chapter 5. Poirot's Grand Reveal. The grand drawing room of Ashford Manor was heavy with tension. The air carried a weight of unspoken fears, unvoiced suspicions. The guests, No, the suspects sat in silence, their gazes flitting toward one another. At the centre of it all stood Hercule Poirot, hands folded neatly before him, his sharp eyes observing the room like a master appraising a finished puzzle. The pieces had been scattered, the picture incomplete, but now, at last, he saw the whole. Lord Reginald Ashford sat stiffly in his chair, his face drawn, his hands clasped too tightly in his lap. Eleanor Hartley, pale and wide-eyed, stole nervous glances at Poirot as if willing him to absolve her of blame. Henry Stokes scowled, his fingers tapping a rhythmic pattern against the arm of his chair, while Madame Renée Laurent, ever inscrutable, studied her nails with idle amusement. "You have called us all here, Poirot," Ashford said, his voice tight. "So, tell us, what game are we playing now?" Poirot allowed himself a small smile. "No game, Lord Ashford." A revelation, his gaze swept across them. "The time has come, mes amis, to uncover the truth. Tonight, we shall see who among you played the final hand in Whitmore's wager, who bet not with cards or coin, but with a man's life." A hush fell. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, as if the manor itself braced for the truth. Poirot paced slowly before the assembled guests, his voice calm yet commanding. "Let us return, mes amis, to the night of the wager." His eyes flickered toward Lord Ashford. "You proposed the bet, did you not?" Ashford hesitated. "I did." Poirot nodded. "But it was not a bet on money nor reputation. It was something else entirely." His gaze sharpened. It was a test. A ripple of unease moved through the room. Charles Whitmore was many things: a gambler, a cheat, a man without conscience. But he was also a keeper of secrets. That night, he was not merely playing for sport. He was wagering the past itself. Poirot turned to Henry Stokes. "You accused Whitmore of cheating you. But tell me, monsieur, was it merely money that he took from you?" Stokes paled. I lost my company." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Ah, but you were not the only one to lose something to Whitmore, were you?" His gaze landed on Madame Laurent, who arched an eyebrow. "You spoke of a debt," Poirot continued, "a stolen painting. And yet, you did not seek repayment in coin." Madame Laurent's lips curled. "I sought something far more valuable." "A name," Poirot said softly. "The name of the one who betrayed you all." The room held its breath. Slowly, Poirot turned back to Lord Ashford. "And that, mon ami, is why you killed him." Lord Ashford stiffened. "You're mistaken." "Am I?" Poirot's voice was gentle, yet unyielding. "Then let us speak of the wager itself." He stepped closer. "You see, Whitmore held a secret, did he not? A secret that, if revealed, would have ruined you." Ashford's jaw tightened. "Nonsense." Poirot ignored the protest. 5 years ago, Victor Langley lost everything in a bet against Whitmore. But it was not simply misfortune that befell him. He turned to the others. Whitmore never played fair. And on that night, 5 years ago, someone else was involved. Someone who stood to gain from Langley's downfall. The silence was deafening. Poirot's voice lowered. "It was you, Lord Ashford." Eleanor gasped. Stokes shot to his feet. "That's impossible." Poirot raised a hand. "Non. It is the truth." His gaze bore into Ashford. "You ensured Langley lost that night. You stood beside Whitmore, helping him destroy a man's life. And Whitmore kept your secret. Until now." Ashford's hands trembled. "You did not kill Whitmore over money," Poirot continued. "You killed him because he was ready to betray you." Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. "And that was a wager you could not afford to lose." The room was deathly still, and Lord Ashford was trapped. A hush fell over the room as Poirot spoke, his voice calm yet commanding. "The murder of Charles Whitmore, mes amis, was not an act of impulse, nor a crime of passion. It was a wager carefully designed, not one of fortune, but of death." His sharp gaze settled on Lord Ashford, whose fingers gripped the arms of his chair a fraction too tightly. "Let us return to the night of the wager," Poirot continued. "A toast was made, a glass lifted in the spirit of sport, but only one man would drink." Eleanor gasped. "You mean—" Poirot nodded. "Oui. The poison was not in Whitmore's drink from the beginning. It was placed there at the perfect moment, when the glass was set down, briefly unattended." His eyes flickered toward Ashford. "And who, I ask, had the opportunity to do so?" Silence. Then, "This is ridiculous," Ashford snapped. "Is it?" Poirot's voice was smooth. "Or is it merely inconvenient? A single poisoned glass, a single subtle moment of misdirection, and suddenly, a wager had become a death sentence. But of course," Poirot added, "our murderer needed one final trick to ensure we all looked the wrong way." His fingers tapped against the table. "Which brings us to the missing card." Poirot gestured toward the deck of cards resting on the desk. "Throughout this case, one question has lingered. Why was a card missing from Whitmore's deck?" Henry Stokes exhaled sharply. "I assumed it was carelessness or a gambler's superstition." Poirot smiled. "Ah, non, mon ami, it was neither." His fingers traced the edges of the remaining cards. "A missing card, you see, is an unfinished hand, an unanswered question." He paused, his gaze flickering toward Ashford. "And in this case, a deliberate misdirection." A murmur rippled through the room. "The moment we saw an incomplete deck," Poirot continued, "we assumed that the missing card was the key to the crime. But that was the trick, mes amis. That was the deception." He exhaled softly. "The missing card meant nothing, but by making us believe it did, our murderer ensured that we looked at a phantom clue and away from the truth." His eyes met Ashford's. It was a masterful move, but even the cleverest deception cannot escape the eyes of Poirot. Ashford's jaw tightened. "Because guilt," Poirot murmured, "always finds a way to reveal itself." Poirot stepped forward, his voice gentle but unrelenting. "There is something curious about guilt, mes amis. It manifests not in words, but in actions." He gestured toward Lord Ashford, his moustache twitching. "A man who is innocent stands firm in his denial, but a man who is guilty—" Poirot's voice softened. "Ah," his hands shake, ever so slightly. "He avoids meeting the eyes of those who seek the truth." He let the words linger. "You have been trembling all evening, Lord Ashford." A muscle in Ashford's jaw flickered. "You are mistaken." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Am I? And yet, even now, your hands clutch the chair as if it were the last bet you could not afford to lose." Silence. Henry Stokes shifted uncomfortably. Madame Laurent smirked behind her glass of wine. Poirot tilted his head. "Shall we reveal the final card, Lord Ashford?" A bead of sweat formed at Ashford's temple. He had already lost. Poirot placed a single folded note on the table. "In Whitmore's gold money clip, we found this," he said. Ashford's breath hitched. Poirot unfolded the note and read aloud. "The game is up. I know what you did to Langley." A gasp from Eleanor. Stokes's face paled. Poirot's voice was quiet. "Whitmore was no fool. He knew the past was catching up to him. He knew he was in danger." He turned toward Ashford. "And he knew precisely who would kill to keep their sins buried." Ashford shot to his feet. "This proves nothing." Poirot only smiled. "Non, mon ami. It proves everything." The shaking hands, the poisoned glass, the calculated removal of a single card, the planted clues to frame Eleanor. "All of it," Poirot said, "was your wager. A final gamble to save yourself." His voice dropped to a whisper. "But you have lost." And Ashford had nothing left to say. The room was silent. Lord Ashford's breath came in short, shallow gasps. He looked to the others, Stokes, Madame Laurent, Eleanor, but found no allies, no escape. Poirot straightened his cuffs. You played well, Lord Ashford, but in the end, his moustache twitched. Even the cleverest wager cannot outsmart the truth. The weight of the words settled. A moment later, footsteps echoed from the hall as the authorities entered. 2 officers approached Ashford. He did not resist. There was nothing left to fight. As he was led toward the door, he paused, glancing back at Poirot. You always knew, didn't you? Poirot tilted his head. I suspected, but the truth, Lord Ashford, always reveals itself. Ashford's eyes darkened. I should have bet against you. Poirot smiled. Ah, but that, mon ami, is the one wager you would never win. And with that, the final hand was played. The case of the bet that cost a life was over. Final chapter. The cost of a life. The corridors of Ashford Manor were quieter now. The grand estate, once filled with whispers of wagers and secrets, had been reduced to a hushed solemnity. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, but inside, only the echo of past sins remained. Poirot and Hastings stood by the fireplace, watching as Lord Ashford was led away in handcuffs, his face pale, his once unshakable composure now a ghost of itself. Hastings let out a breath. And so, it's over. Poirot nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. Oui, mon ami. The case is solved. But tell me, do you feel that it is truly over? Hastings frowned. What do you mean? Poirot tapped a finger against his chin. Whitmore was a scoundrel, a man who played games with the lives of others. And yet, in the end, he became the victim of the very game he thought he controlled. Hastings exhaled. It was greed, wasn't it? Greed, pride, arrogance. It cost him his life. Poirot inclined his head. Perhaps. Or perhaps it was something more dangerous still. The belief that a man can control fate. He glanced toward the grand chandelier above, its light flickering. One can cheat at cards, Hastings, but one cannot cheat destiny. Hastings studied his friend's face. There was something deeper there, a question Poirot had yet to answer, and perhaps he never would. Eleanor Hartley stood by the great doors of Ashford Manor, her hands clasped together, her gaze distant. Poirot approached quietly. Mademoiselle. She turned, offering a weak smile. Monsieur Poirot. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of the night still lingered between them. Then, she sighed. I thought I knew him, you know. Poirot inclined his head. Charles Whitmore? She nodded. I believed he loved me, that I was different from his other games. Her voice wavered. But in the end, I was just another wager, wasn't I? Poirot was silent for a moment. Then, gently, he said, Men like Whitmore, mademoiselle, they do not see love as others do. To them, affection is a game, a challenge, and yet, even the best gamblers must one day face their losses. She let out a quiet laugh, though it held no joy. And he lost everything. Poirot regarded her carefully. And what will you do now? Eleanor's fingers curled slightly. Leave, she murmured. Go somewhere where his shadow does not follow me. Poirot nodded. Perhaps, mademoiselle, that is the greatest wager of all, to start anew. She gave him one last look. Then, with a deep breath, she stepped out into the night. And with her, the last trace of Charles Whitmore's reckless love disappeared into the darkness. Poirot sat in an armchair, his fingers pressed together in thought. Across from him, Hastings poured a glass of brandy, though he did not drink. Do you know what troubles me, Hastings? Poirot said quietly. His friend glanced up. That the case is closed, and yet you are still thinking. Poirot chuckled softly. It is not the case that troubles me, mon ami. It is the lesson it leaves behind. Hastings frowned. What do you mean? Poirot leaned forward slightly. Gambling, Hastings, is not merely a game of cards. It is a game of risk, of fate, of life itself. He gestured toward the empty glass on the table. Whitmore wagered too much, and in doing so, he sealed his own fate. Hastings exhaled. So, in the end, it wasn't just about money, was it? Poirot shook his head. No. Some men gamble not only with coin but with their very existence, and one day, Hastings, they lose. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the silence between them. Poirot sighed. The tragedy, mon ami, is that Whitmore did not realize the cost of his wager until it was far too late. Hastings studied his friend's face. And what about Ashford? Poirot's voice was quiet. Ah, Hastings. Ashford thought he was playing a clever game. But tell me, what is more foolish, the man who places the bet, or the one who believes he can change the odds? Hastings had no answer. Later that night, as the carriage rumbled through the dimly lit streets, Hastings found himself lost in thought. Poirot sat beside him, eyes closed, his expression unreadable. Finally, Hastings spoke. It's strange, isn't it? Poirot's eyes flickered open. What is, mon ami? Hastings exhaled. How much people are willing to risk? Money, love, reputation, even their own lives. Poirot nodded. Oui, that is the nature of human folly. Hastings shook his head. I mean, look at this case. Whitmore thought he was untouchable. Ashford thought he could outplay justice. And Eleanor, well, she wagered her heart, didn't she? Poirot regarded him carefully. And what does this tell you, Hastings? Hastings hesitated. That we're all gamblers, in our own way. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, mon ami, and there is the greatest truth of all. Hastings frowned. But what makes a wager worth it, Poirot? When does the risk outweigh the reward? Poirot's voice softened. When a man forgets what he stands to lose. Hastings sat back in his seat, staring at the city beyond the window. And Whitmore, he forgot, didn't he? Poirot sighed. No, Hastings. His voice was quiet. He never knew. And the carriage continued onward, carrying them away from one story and toward the next. The carriage arrived at Poirot's residence. The night had settled over London, its streets bathed in the dim glow of street lamps. Hastings turned to his friend. Poirot, do you ever wonder if justice is enough? Poirot regarded him. Justice, mon ami, is merely the settling of accounts. But what of the debt that remains unpaid? Hastings frowned. What do you mean? Poirot exhaled. A wager can win you riches, but it can also cost you your soul. A silence stretched between them. Finally, Hastings spoke. And what of those who place their bets too late? Poirot's moustache twitched. Ah, Hastings, fate has no mercy for the foolish. And with that, the knights swallowed their words, leaving only the echoes of a wager that had finally been called. Thank you for tuning in to Mind Sherlock. If you enjoyed this mind-bending mystery, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on more thrilling detective adventures. Your support keeps the stories flowing and the mysteries unraveling. We'd love to hear your thoughts. How did you find this story? If you have any suggestions or theories, feel free to share them in the comments below. Your input keeps the mystery alive.